Next, I want to talk about the frustration aggression hypothesis. Um, According to this theoretical explanation for aggression, uh, this idea states that people who are frustrated, they're thwarted or prevented from achieving goals, annoyed or threatened, will behave in aggressive fashions because aggression in and of itself is a natural and almost automatic response to frustration. It's kind of part of who we are as humans. This can follow a simple pattern. The first part of this pattern would be that the individual becomes blocked from obtaining some expected goal. They don't achieve social goal, financial goal, personal goal. The type of goal doesn't really matter. Um, when this occurs, frustration results, which generates an anger. Sounds a little bit like strain theory, doesn't it? Think about your studies of Merton and Agnew. Now, when people get frustrated and angry, the anger doesn't necessarily cause the aggression, but the anger predisposes the individual or gets them ready to become aggressive, to become, and that aggression may result again in violence. Aggression may or may not occur based on learned reactions. In other words, how the individual learned was the appropriate way with coping with aggressive feelings or feeling. Excuse me. Maybe aggression may occur or may not occur based on whether or not the individual learned appropriate responses to frustration or anger. Think about in week 3 we have the story of Steve and Sam. Certainly in there was some social learning of drinking as a response to frustration and anger. In this case, the frustration aggression hypothesis states that you may have a social learned violence, maybe the socially or aggression may be the learned response. Aggression also the whether or not aggression occurs may be based on the individual's interpretation of events and how they perceive the events that led to the frustration. May also determine whether or not aggression occurs. And then finally, there's the individual's coping mechanisms. Individuals with good coping skills and have good abilities to control anger and aggression are less likely that when frustration occurs, they're less likely to become aggressive because they have some personal coping mechanisms to help them deal with it in other ways. Next would be the cognitive neo-association model. This model proposes that an adverse effect or an adverse effect, so something bad happens, can produce a negative affect. In other words, a negative reaction. So something bad happens, the individual has a negative affect or something bad reaction. The affect could be simple discomfort, could be a physical or psychological discomfort. And it'll be something that the person something that happens that the person recognizes the situation as aversive. In other words, aggression is not going to happen no matter how bad the thing that happens to them is. If they don't recognize the situation as adverse, then there isn't an aggressive reaction according to this model. That makes a fair amount of sense. With this model, they also propose that some people may react quickly on the basis of initial emotions and engage in violence. But if the individual, through personal coping mechanisms or socially learned responses, is able to get past the initial feeling, the initial emotions, they will be more able to process their emotions and make attempts to control their feelings. Think about your own lives. The times that you've experienced something frustrating that's happened in your life. Somebody has in the moment made you angry, um, cut you off in traffic, or said something or did something to upset you. And think about that initial burst of emotion that comes along with it. Some people, when they get that initial burst of emotion, react on it. And usually when we get that negative effect, that negative effect that occurs, that bad thing that happens, a person makes us mad, whatever. When we react off those initial emotions, usually the reaction, not usually, but often that reaction expresses itself through aggressive or violent behavior. And you think about times in your life where you just, something happened and you snapped and you went off on somebody. Maybe you weren't physically aggressive, but maybe you were verbally aggressive. Maybe you were just downright mean. Think about the waitress that gave you bad service on the wrong day, or the customer that normally you're the nicest person in the world, but on the wrong day, the customer said just the wrong. Your boss said just the wrong thing to you, and you went off on them. But then then consider that most of the time, if you can get past that initial pissed off, if you can get past that initial emotional response to the action, and you have time to think about it, you go, oh, okay, well, and you can process it, and you may still be angry, but if you can process it, you have a better chance of avoiding an aggressive response. That's what the cognitive neo-association model says. It basically just says it boils down to if you have time to think about it, if you have enough personal coping mechanism that you can stop yourself from reacting, you can avoid aggression if you so choose. Let's see. Next one I got on my list. Excitation transfer theory. This is based on an assumption that physiological arousal dissipates slowly over time. So we're thinking still kind of along the Freudian line that aggressive feelings build up over time. But Freud just says they build up, and you get to they build up until you get to the saturation point, you explode, or you find some sort of appropriate release. The excitation transfer theory, on the other hand, says that it kind of agrees with Freud that aggressive feelings, physiological arousal, as they say it, builds up over time. But they also say it dissipates over time. That if the frustration, anger doesn't reach the saturation point, it just kind of slowly goes away. You get over it. However, if additional things happen, if additional stimuli come along before the initial arousal dissipates, there may be an additive effect, causing the person to react more intensely to secondary events. It's kind of related to the idea of displaced aggression. And displaced aggression being the idea that aggression is displaced when the target of aggression is innocent of wrongdoing, but simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so the idea we're talking about here is, let's say, in the course of a day. Let's think. One of my favorite songs, a song by the O.C. Supertones called "Jury Duty." And I feel really bad for the guy who writes the song. It's just a whole string of really bad things happen to him. He gets jury duty. Well, there's your initial physiological arousal, because who likes jury duty except for criminal justice majors? And then he gets out and his car doesn't start. And so we have more aggression added to the original event. Before the aggression from the original event, the frustration from the original event dissipates. And then he gets stuck in traffic. And then the book he brought to read while waiting to get called into the courtroom, he finishes it before lunch. And maybe while he's waiting, and he's waiting. He's got a little book to read. Of course, in the song, he's got a book by C.S. Lewis, and that makes him feel better. And so, his frustration, anxiety starts to dissipate. Groovy. But then the book, he's out of book, and any lunchtime yet. I guess he brought a short one. I guess he should have bought a Kindle. And so now he's frustrated, and now we're adding on to the frustration before the initial arousal the initial frustrations had time to dissipate. Now, of course, the song turns out really well, but imagine this guy goes home, and maybe he's had a bad day at the court, and he gets held over, and other bad things happen. He gets stuck in traffic on the way home. He gets home, and his wife says, "How was your day?" And that was it. And see, then he explodes on the wife. It's not the wife's fault, but she was there, and so the aggression gets displaced onto the poor wife. And the funny thing is that, well, not the funny thing, but what really happens is our feelings about the initial thing that made us mad tends to get carried longer than normal. It can also get carried on normal, not just by additional bad things happen, but we tend to stew about it, tend to think about it. Excuse me. Okay. Now we can keep him from knocking the camera over. Everyone say hi to Gus. He's my pest. Like you really need. That was an important part of your lesson, was to meet Dr. Day's cat. All right. I want to talk about what's on my list. Okay. Next thing on my list to talk about, since I have a few more minutes for this video, is some possible social learning factors that can involved in aggression and violence. They look happy. He's purring. And I've already mentioned a few times, where social learning can be a part of some of the other things we've already talked about. So let's just talk about social learning in and of itself. And you're already familiar with social learning theory, so I'm not going to explain the theory in detail, but rather give you a couple of lists to kind of add to your notes. The first kind of list I would give you are some conditions that facilitate or are conducive to the learning of aggression. And there are three. Go away, Gus. It's good that I'm wearing orange. The first is that if there are many opportunities to observe aggression. Remember, social learning is the idea that we are born blank slates, and we learn all behavior through interaction with others. So, if there are excessive opportunities to observe aggression, that facilitates the learning of aggression. The second thing that might facilitate the learning of aggression is the reinforcement of a child's aggression. The parent that encourages their kid to fight, or provide, or the receipt of social rewards for fighting or being tough. Could be the father or mother who reinforces, encourages, or socially rewards a child for being especially aggressive in athletics. The kid plays football or soccer, or soccer is all that violent. Some karate, if they've got a bad teacher. The third condition that may facilitate learning of aggression is that the child is the subject of aggression herself. In other words, we're talking about where the child is the victim of the individual is a victim of child abuse. That's probably the strongest of the three. This is where the child learns most effectively that violence is how you handle your own aggression. That when you're feeling bad, you beat somebody up and you feel better, because that's what Daddy did. Whew, that's depressing. When we talk about social learning of aggression, we should also talk about modeling. Modeling is occurs when children imitate behavior and then are rewarded by praise or encouragement from significant role models. When this occurs, the probability that the behavior is repeated increases. For a child, there are three, of course, there are lots of role models, but if we were to put them in categories, or maybe say the three types of models, we could say the first type of model is family members, and this would be in the order of significance. The first being family members, second being members of one's own subculture, and so other folks in the neighborhood, other people like you, or other people who are like you perceive yourself to be. And then the third would be symbolic models, and that be anyone that the individual looks up to, respects, could be real or imagined. And like I said, symbolic role models. So it could be Superman, Batman, or Darth Vader. There are some limitations or some things that stand in the way of observational learning, stand in the way of learning aggressive behavior. And I give you a list of four. The first is the failure to notice essential features of the behavior. If you miss something, it's like if you're learning how to hotwire a car and you learn and you miss a step. Well, you're not going to be real successful at it. If you're not successful at it, then the behavior is not rewarded. There you go. You learn how to play golf. There are so many frustrating things to learning a good golf swing. You've got to stand with your feet balanced just right. You've got to address the ball properly. You've got to have the proper grip on the club. When you're in your backswing, you've got to keep, you only bend one elbow, and you got to keep your head down throughout the whole thing. And when you swing through the ball, the club face has to hit the ball in the right spot, and you have to have this nice follow through. And if you miss one of those steps, your ball didn't go where you want it to. Well, in learning how to do a proper golf swing, if your instructor or you're trying to teach yourself, if you miss one of those steps in the learning process, your golf swing doesn't work. Without success or any kind of reward, you don't repeat the behavior because if you can try to learn to be a good golfer, but eventually, if you can't hit a driver off the tee, you say, heck with this. I'll learn to bowl. Or I'll get a week. Second limitation, observational learning, would be a lack of motivation to rehearse or repeat what is seen. In order to repeat what you've seen, you have to have some reason to do it, some motivation. If you don't want to do it, you're not going to do it. It's what we do with the kids in the youth commission. We've always said that the rehabilitation program we had when I was a member of the Texas Youth Commission was a very good program. But the kids had to be motivated. They had to believe in it. They had to buy into it. They had to have a reason to engage in the behaviors we wanted them to. Without motivation, they wouldn't do it. Third limitation is the observance of punishment or rewards. If the child is watching the behavior and doesn't see any reward, well, if there's no profit in it, why should I do it? By profit, I don't just mean financial. If there's no reward, if the individual sees that the behavior is punished, I ain't doing that. The kid sees daddy hit mom, and then daddy goes to prison for a while. Well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. I don't think I'll do that. And then there's a lack of reinforcement over time. With any kind of social learning, there has to be a reinforcement of the behavior over time before it becomes a habit. And without that reinforcement, it doesn't happen. Okay, that's it for part 2. Hopefully this part will render properly. Okay. Next I'll talk about cognitive models of aggression.